What is up, enthusiasts? 80-Seater Flags here, and welcome back to another one of my videos. Today we are going to be talking about something that I have not really talked about on this channel for a while. Now, I've been fortunate enough to travel to parks all over the eastern United States, but today I want to talk about a coaster that is near and dear to me, as it was one of the closest roller coasters to me when I was younger. This is Conneaut Lake Park's Blue Streak, what once was one of the greatest roller coasters on Earth when it opened up in the 1930s. It had a very tumultuous history and eventually closed down and ended up being the victim of a controlled burning. Today, I don't want to neglect on the unfortunate fate of this ride, but instead talk about my personal experience on this ride. Now, I got to first ride this in 2015, and that's very important because in 2017, they replaced the trains with much smaller and much more restrictive trains with seatbelts. So even though you may see some 3-car trains in the off-ride footage, I rode the 4-car trains, which were much less restrictive and the subject of this video today. So today I'm going to talk about a roller coaster that not many enthusiasts got to ride before its demise. This is Cedar Flags, and today we are going to revisit what might be one of the most sketchiest roller coasters I have ever been on. The ride opened up all the way back in 1938, and it was designed by the one and only Edward A. Vettel. It has a pretty simple out and back layout with a 78-foot lift and almost 3,000 feet of track. It has a pretty simple layout, but the execution this coaster had was definitely interesting. I first got to ride it in 2015, but keep in mind before then, the ride had a lot of tumultuous history. First off, it operated from the 30s to 1994, but then was SB&O from 1995 to 1996. Operated from 1997 to 2006, and was SB&O once again from 2007 to 2010. And from 2010 to 2019, many people got to enjoy the last run of this incredible coaster. So, how did it run? Well, let's go back to that day in 2015. I had much less experience with coasters, so I didn't know what to expect. And I have to say, unfortunately, I did not get to experience the park in its heyday. The park was an absolute wreck even when I went, and you could tell that there was a lot of TLC needed to keep this park alive. Though the roller coaster looked lively and I was interested. This coaster has a very historic looking station and it is very intriguing. There's also a plaque that says it is an Ace Coaster landmark, which makes it all the more interesting. You go into the short queue and quickly into the station. And this ride was manual on almost everything. The brakes were hand powered, and to get the train out of the station, operators had to push the trains manually out of the station. It was crazy. It is finally my turn to ride, and I get into the 4-car trains. And I noticed something very interesting: the lack of this ride's restraints. And if you don't know, this ride, when I first rode it, had some of the least restrictive restraints I ever experienced. Buzz bars, no seatbelts, and no seat dividers. This ride was even less restrictive than Phoenix at Knoebels. This ride was completely free, and you could move all about while sitting. It honestly felt a little dangerous at the time. But putting down that buzz bar with no seatbelts, sitting alone in a row, and knowing that there is no more restraint was a pretty bizarre feeling. The amount of bizarre does not stop there, as you go into one of the weirdest pre-lifts I've ever seen on the ride: a tunnel. Now, there are a lot of wooden coasters that start off with a tunnel, like the aforementioned Phoenix at Knoebels, but just like the rest of the park, the tunnel did not seem very well maintained. You could tell that the tunnel was basically rotting in on itself, and there were a lot of holes and a lot of tarp surrounding the tunnel, and the lift is even more sketchy than the pre-lift. Covered in rust and swinging back and forth, this lift did not seem very interesting, but it definitely added to that small park charm. You go up the very slow lift, and then you reach the crevice. If you're looking for a smooth, nice wooden coaster, this was the exact opposite of what you wanted. You go down this extremely steep drop into one of the roughest valleys I have ever experienced on a coaster. And I mean, it was rough. You could easily tell that this coaster could have easily been condemned just a few years prior. I think this truly was the roughest coaster I have ever been on in my life. You go down into another valley, even rougher this time, and then go into another camelback. After that, you go into a turnaround. Now, the turnaround was actually pretty smooth, but there was an S-bend right after this turnaround that led into a very nasty pothole. Probably the nastiest transition I have ever seen on a coaster. The finale of the ride consists of some low to the ground airtime moments, but at that point the ride lost most of its momentum, so it really didn't change that much. And the ride was over, ending off with a curved brake run similar to, once again, Phoenix. And at that point I knew this was the worst coaster I have ever been on. And though the ride was the most painful coaster I've ever been on, I decided to keep riding because of the lack of rides that were at the rest of the park. I had all day there, why not I lap this thing? I kept going on and on and on. But I was a little nervous to get in the back row, until two cute girls came up to me and said, "If you ride in the back, we'll give you $10. And so, guess what I did? Funny enough, I didn't get the $10, but I got one of the craziest ride experiences of my entire life. And even though I got scammed, I have to thank the two of them for what is quite possibly the craziest ride I've ever gotten on a coaster. Now, it is basically everything I just said, but cranked up to 11. Sitting in the back row, once again, no seatbelt, no seat divider, just a tiny buzz bar. It was a scary experience going up that lift hill. And so, I'm going up the hill, and then the first drop. Think of a ride like Raven at Holiday World, and that drop that goes into the woods. Imagine that in the back row, but with only buzz bars. This is how it felt. My waist reached the top of the seat and crushed onto that buzz bar, while I was 3 inches off of my seat. This wasn't some normal floater airtime either. I was shot out of my seat and holding on for dear life. Now, this was 2015. It was a pretty long time ago, but I still had a tolerance for coasters. At that time, I conquered Millennium Force, Top Thrill Dragster, Phantom's Revenge. I knew what an extreme coaster was, and this was no exception. I was more scared on this than I ever was on any of those aforementioned rides. And just like the first ride I took, once I hit the valley, one of the absolutely roughest experiences of my life. And I mean rough. I have been on some pretty rough woodies, like Wildcat at Lake Compounce and Hellcat at Clementon Park. Those rides bang you up a bit, but nothing compared to Blue Streak. Well, the other rides kind of shook you a little bit. This ride shook you like an absolute blender. I was shocked that this ride stayed on the track after how much it shook. The rest of the ride was no different. Very rough on the valleys, but very violent airtime on the camelbacks, especially that second camelback. And to this day, I think that is the most violent airtime moment I have ever experienced in my life. I've experienced many stronger moments, like on rides like Skyrush and Iron Gwazi and El Toro, but not with the restraint system that ride had. What I'm about to say may be a little cliche, but I miss this ride in a sort of way. And you know what they say, you're never gonna love something until it's gone, but it's true. Was it still a bad ride? Of course, it was probably the worst wooden coaster I've ever been on. But at the same time, there was a much better way to handle this. Maybe a major retrack, maybe a major refurbishment. Imagine this ride getting a Great Coasters International or Gravity Group refurbishment, and it would be good as new, maybe even better than ever. It's just really sad to think that even before this ride closed down forever, that there was just a much better way. This ride was in such bad shape that it was unbearable when it came to how rough it was, and it just really makes this story that much more sad. But I'm here to remember it, even though I wasn't the biggest fan of it. But let me know in the comments below about some of your defunct coaster stories, and maybe even if you got to ride Blue Streak, let me know in the comments below, especially if you rode before the modifications. Anyways, until next time, this is Cedar Flags, and I will see you all later.